Nils Antenzana opened his eyes on May 18, 2004, in his small tent at 8,000 meters on Mount Everest's Camp 4. His breathing was labored, as he had been sleeping for the last few hours in the death zone, one of the few places on our planet that is void of any life, and is literally killing the cells in your body the second you decide to climb this high. Nils did not know that this would be his final time ever waking from his sleep. He was 69 years old and attempting to become the oldest climber to ever reach the roof of the world. His guide, Lisi Gustavo, was waking up beside him. Together, the pair had been preparing for this day for months, but for Nils, it had been an entire lifetime. It was summit day. This is their story. Gladys Antenzana had just woken in her Baltimore hospital bed, resting after a minor surgery. She was waiting for a phone call from her husband Nils, who had always called her after reaching the summit of countless mountains across the world. But this peak was different. Nils was climbing the tallest mountain in the world, Mount Everest. For more than 2 decades, Nils Antenzana had been the chief of pathology at Jefferson Memorial Hospital in Alexandria. He was an immigrant who received his medical training in Bolivia before passing the US exam with the ability to speak little English. In 1994, after the hospital closed, he worked as a freelancer with several different medical offices and hospitals providing consultations. This gave him a lot more free time. At first, he filled it with charity work, but even his wife recalled a moment where Nils would say, "With you, I am very happy, but I seem to be missing something." Nils would begin exploring other hobbies, such as scuba diving, hand gliding, skydiving, and eventually mountaineering. While he enjoyed having an active lifestyle, there was just something about the mountains that attracted him. Nils would dive into this passion, but almost nobody knew of his secret hobby. His wife noticed one day her husband was missing and would start asking around where he was. She eventually heard it from a family friend that he was climbing a peak in Bolivia and would be gone for 4 days. She would state, "I don't know why he didn't want me and others to know, but sometimes he was just that way." One morning, after taking a shower, Nils would look at his wife and say, "Gladys, I want to go to Everest." She had heard of his dream for years and knew that she could not stop him. The truth was, the mountain scared her, but she couldn't say no. Instead, she said, "God bless you." Nils would begin preparing for the expedition almost right away. He went off to South America to dive into climbing. He began reading articles and journals around oxygen-famished high altitudes. He read Everest books over and over, analyzing important areas, and even looked into medications that might ward off high-altitude sickness. On one of Nils' trips to South America, he would meet Gustavo Lisi, and within weeks, Lisi became Nils' climbing partner. Gustavo was much younger than Nils, but they developed a bond on the mountain. And just a month later, Nils would ask Gustavo to accompany him to Everest, as he felt better with a native Spanish speaker by his side. Nils agreed to pay all of Gustavo's expenses, with a bonus of $10,000 for successfully bringing him to the summit of Everest and back. Gustavo agreed, and the men began putting their plan into motion. The pair would fly to Rome in early April, where they would meet an Italian man named Manuel Logli, the head of an expedition company called the Infinite Knot. Manuel would secure permits for the duo, along with providing everything they would need to summit Everest, such as food, drinks, oxygen, and of course tents. Manuel would hire 2 experienced Sherpas to guide and provide assistance where needed. Nils and Gustavo would technically be a part of a 9-man expedition, but really they only joined the group to pay a cheaper permit fee. Nils paid $20,000 for both of them to obtain access to the mountain, and they made it clear to the expedition that once they reached Everest, they would use the supplies they paid for, but they would be climbing alone. Manuel would state in an email to the Washington Post that the pair made Gustavo's role very clear. He would be Nils' guide. There was no rules or regulations from the Nepali government that says climbers must remain part of the expeditions they obtain their permits through, so nobody batted an eye that the duo wanted to climb alone. In fact, it was pretty normal for small groups to band together on paper for cheaper rates. Manuel would keep an eye on Nils through their trek to base camp, as he wanted to see how strong the elderly climber was, but he soon realized it was not Nils he needed to worry about. According to Manuel, Nils told told him that midway through the first week, while ascending toward a small village at an altitude of 14,500 feet, Gustavo trekked so far ahead of him that Nils lost sight of his guide and got confused when he arrived at a fork in the path. Nils eventually chose the wrong direction and walked for over an hour before he realized his mistake and had to double back. Nils would have to receive treatment the following day for a sore throat and would describe his climbing partner as rude and disrespectful. Gustavo had called Nils stupid for getting lost, yelling at him, and Nils had even threatened to fire him, but the duo would continue working together. After reaching Everest's base camp, the problems would continue for Nils. He would develop an upper respiratory tract infection, making it difficult to breathe, along with dehydration and general weakness. He would lose 16 pounds before he even began to climb the mountain, and had serious thoughts about returning home. But Nils had been preparing his entire life for this climb, and after resting for 4 days, he would start his acclimatization trips. There are 4 camps above base camp, and the acclimatization treks are limited to the first 3, with expeditions trekking up and down the mountain over frozen, dangerously unstable ice falls as tall as skyscrapers, and along steep faces where climbers latch themselves on fixed ropes nailed into the mountain, where one mistake can mean a fatal fall. Gustavo would continue to leave Nils during their climbs, and Nils would state in his journal, "I almost fired him. He does not have a good sense of responsibility and confuses it with servitude." On Friday, May 7th, an accomplished Mexican climber named Hector Ponce de Leon says he saw Nils' party descending from the 24,000-foot Camp 3 toward Camp 2, a journey that eventually took the climbers onto a glacier pitted in places by crevasses undetectable beneath the snow. Hector glanced at Nils and worried. He looked for Gustavo, who was about 220 yards ahead of him, a speck in the distance. I thought to myself, Gustavo left him. Unbelievable. Nils appeared unstable, unable to walk a straight line. He was wasted, and they were only in the acclimatization climbs. He was so wasted he couldn't even see the right way to the camp. Several climbers and Sherpas had concerns about Gustavo, which only magnified when they learned that there was actually no record of him reaching Everest's summit in 2000, which he claimed was the case to anyone who would listen. After being confronted, he would adamantly deny that he ever made such claims. 30 days into their expedition, the duo would begin to prepare for their final push for the summit. The pair would set out on the Khumbu Icefall early in the morning, along with many other climbers, kicking off their final trip up the mountain. Their expedition went well until they reached Camp 3. Nils would climb from Camp 3 to Camp 4 at 26,000 feet without bottled oxygen. To put this into perspective, even some of the most experienced guides in the world use bottled oxygen past Camp 3 unless they are attempting a summit without it. This is because Camp 4 lies in the death zone, an area where the oxygen is a third of what it is at sea level. Worse, any oxygen-famished body will be that much more susceptible in the death zone to conditions such as hypothermia and cerebral edema, the latter condition being where fluids leak from blood vessels and swell the brain, bringing a coma and swift death if untreated. Gustavo would later state that Nils had insisted on climbing without bottled oxygen between Camp 3 and 4, claiming that he wanted nothing the others in the party wouldn't be using. 2 Sherpas would claim that Nils would be forced to use oxygen during the final hour and a half of the climb, as he was tiring and slowing down, barely able to take steps up the slope. To combat this, Gustavo would claim they needed to rest a day in the death zone. A Sherpa on the mountain at the time would state, "A terrible decision. The air has so little oxygen up there that every moment you spend there takes something more out of you. It is not a place to rest long. Everyone knows that." On May 17th, Nils would call his wife from Camp 4 and let her know that they were preparing to make the final summit push, and they would be leaving that night in the dark. And that's exactly what they did. The temperature was estimated to be -7 degrees. Another group that passed Nils on the way to the summit would notice how much he struggled. He relied on the support of his ice axe to stand, and they thought that he would be turning around, as there was no way he could reach the summit. The 2 Sherpas that were hired to provide assistance to Nils and Gustavo would tell them to turn around, but they would both claim they did not quit. it would not leave the peak. After 14 hours of climbing, Nils would cross the final ridge at approximately 10 a.m. He would stand on top of the world, accomplishing his dream. He was the oldest American and second oldest climber to ever reach the summit. They would spend 40 minutes at the top, exhausted and admiring the views above the clouds. Most climbers spend minutes on the slope, but Nils was simply too tired to begin his descent. Almost immediately after starting their climb down, Nils would have issues. The adrenaline was gone, and his body was beginning to fail. It took an hour before he collapsed for the first time. Those around the pair would state that he was showing classic signs of cerebral edema. He was disoriented, unstable, his sight impaired, and his movements reduced to stumbles. It would take 3 hours for them to descend 300 feet. The sun began to go down, and the realization of the predicament began to set in. While there were many mistakes made on this climb, what would happen next would be the most egregious of them all. Gustavo would begin descending the mountain at a faster pace, leaving Nils with 2 Sherpas who were practically carrying him down the mountain. For the next several hours, the 2 Sherpas would continue to support Nils, but he would soon begin to slip in and out of consciousness. About 100 feet ahead of them, Gustavo would dig a bivouac in the snow, climb into his sleeping bag, and begin to nap. By later afternoon, the Sherpas were spent. They began to think that they themselves would be in trouble, as they propped Nils against a block of ice and snow to rest at the balcony, an area about 1,600 feet above Camp 4. The 2 Sherpas would remove their coat and place it on Nils, along with removing their extra bottles of oxygen, placing them within reach against the doctor's side. They had done everything they could, but Nils needed more help than they could provide. Hours later, they would come across Gustavo and shake him awake, as he was at risk of developing hypothermia if he continued to sleep. Gustavo would pack up his supplies and continue down the mountain with the Sherpas. When they came across another group ascending the mountain, they would inform them that there was a climber at the balcony, but there was some miscommunication as there seemed to be no urgency or need for a rescue. The climbers attempting their own summit would note that all 3 men were exhausted and it looked like they had a rough climb. The 2 Sherpas would eventually leave Gustavo as he was moving too slow and they needed to get down the mountain quickly since they had given up their jackets. But eventually, all 3 men made it back to Camp 4, and they would fail to inform anyone that Nils was still further up on the mountain in dire need of a rescue. The following day, a storm would begin to cloud the peak, and after climbers realized there was a man stranded at the balcony, well, it was too late. There may have been a chance the night before to save Nils, but there was no chance now. Gustavo would call Nils' wife the following morning and describe that there was a terrible accident, but as details began to release, Gladys became furious that more efforts were not made to save her husband or even stop him from summiting. But Gustavo would state that Nils had told him, "I want to stay here. The mountain is my home." Controversy would follow the expedition. Many didn't believe Gustavo was telling the full story or had even lied about some details, but to this day it serves as one of the prime examples of what not to do on a mountain like Everest.